In 1982, construction workers preparing a retirement community near Titusville, Florida, uncovered something that stopped the project entirely. Beneath a shallow pond, in soil kept permanently wet and starved of oxygen, archaeologists found human remains unlike almost anything else recovered in North America. The bodies were not mere bones. In the airless, waterlogged peat, soft tissue had survived, brain matter had survived, and in a discovery that would eventually rewrite what scientists understood about the deep genetic history of the Southeast, so had DNA, ancient DNA, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, dating back roughly 8,000 years. The site was called Windover, and decades later, its genetic legacy would help explain something that had puzzled military historians for nearly 2 centuries. How a coalition of people, the United States Army, fought across 3 separate wars, spending more money and losing more soldiers per capita than in almost any other conflict against a native nation, never actually forced into a final surrender. The Seminole were the only indigenous nation in United States history that the federal government was never able to formally defeat. To understand why, we have to go back far beyond the Seminole Wars, far beyond even European contact, to the swamps, hammocks, and river systems of the Florida Peninsula, a landscape that ancient DNA now reveals was inhabited by sophisticated, adapted human communities for thousands of years before the word Seminole ever existed. The people buried at Windover were not ancestors of the Seminole in any direct or simple sense. The Seminole Nation, as history remembers it, would not emerge as a distinct identity until many thousands of years later. Formed from a complex convergence of migrating Creek-speaking peoples, remnant populations of much older Florida indigenous nations decimated by European disease, and critically escaped enslaved Africans who found refuge deep within Florida's most inaccessible terrain. But the Windover remains reveal something essential about the deep time context. This later convergence occurred within a landscape that had already supported continuous, adapted human life for 8,000 years. A landscape whose swamps, hammocks, and waterways had already proven across millennia that they could shelter people who understood how to use them. The genetic and archaeological evidence from Windover itself is remarkable on its own terms. Researchers recovered brain tissue from more than 90 individuals, an extraordinarily rare preservation event that allowed genetic analysis far more detailed than what is typically possible from ancient skeletal remains alone. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from these individuals revealed lineages connected to the broader founding populations of the Americas, but with patterns specific enough to suggest a population that had already been established in the Florida Peninsula, adapting to its unique wetland ecosystem for a very long time before the site was used as a burial ground. Textile fragments, woven from native plant fibers, were also recovered, some of the oldest woven textiles ever found in North America, further evidence of a sophisticated settled society, not a transient population passing through, but people who had built a genuine, lasting relationship with this specific and challenging environment. That relationship, the accumulated knowledge of how to live within, move through, and draw sustenance from Florida's wetlands, did not disappear when the population buried at Windover eventually gave way, over the following millennia, to the various indigenous nations that Spanish explorers would eventually encounter beginning in the 16th century. Nations like the Calusa, along Florida's southwest coast, built one of the most complex non-agricultural societies documented in North America, a fishing-based economy so productive it supported a population large enough to construct monumental shell-mound architecture without ever needing to develop farming. Nations like the Appalachee in the Florida Panhandle built substantial agricultural communities that Spanish colonizers would later attempt, with mixed success, to convert into a mission system. These were not simple societies. They were complex, adapted, and deeply rooted in specific ecological knowledge of the Florida landscape. Knowledge accumulated across thousands of years, stretching back toward the deep time world revealed at Windover. European contact devastated these populations with a speed and thoroughness that is difficult to overstate. Disease, forced labor under the Spanish mission system, and outright violence reduced Florida's original indigenous population by staggering percentages across the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. By the early 1700s, many of the distinct nations Spanish explorers had originally documented, the Timucua, the Apalachee, the Calusa, among others, had been reduced to fragments of their former population, their survivors scattered, displaced, or absorbed into other communities. It was into this devastated, largely depopulated landscape that Creek-speaking peoples, primarily from what is now Georgia and Alabama, began migrating southward into Florida over the course of the 18th century. Some moved to escape conflict and colonial pressure in their home territories. Some were drawn by the availability of land left empty by the collapse of Florida's original population. Over the following decades, these migrating Creek communities, alongside surviving remnants of Florida's original indigenous nations who had not been entirely destroyed, began to coalesce into distinct new communities, adapting Creek agricultural and political traditions to the specific demands of Florida's subtropical wetland environment, an environment whose deep, accumulated survival knowledge, developed over 8,000 years by the populations whose genetic legacy Windover preserves, was now, in a sense, being learned anew by a genetically and culturally distinct incoming population. The name Seminole itself likely derives from the Creek word Seminole, itself possibly adapted from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild one or runaway, a term originally used to describe cattle or people who had left settled areas for the frontier. This etymology carries a deep and defining irony, because it was precisely this identity, as a people existing at the frontier, beyond the reach of established colonial and later American authority, that would come to define Seminole resistance for the next century and a half. The second, and in many ways equally essential, thread in Seminole ancestry begins with individuals fleeing chattel slavery in Georgia, South Carolina, and later throughout the American South. Florida, first under Spanish and later under contested control, became one of the most significant destinations for escaped enslaved individuals seeking freedom anywhere in North America. Spanish colonial policy, for a combination of strategic and religious reasons, at various points offered freedom to individuals who escaped British colonial enslavement and reached Spanish Florida. Beyond formal Spanish policy, the sheer inaccessibility of Florida's interior wetlands, precisely the terrain that had sheltered human communities continuously since the era documented at Windover, provided a level of practical protection that made successful, permanent escape genuinely possible in a way it rarely was elsewhere in the American South. These individuals, who came to be known historically as Black Seminoles, did not simply live near Seminole communities. Genetic, historical, and archaeological evidence together document a relationship considerably deeper and more integrated than that framing suggests, one involving intermarriage, shared settlements, mutual military alliance, and, in many documented cases, formal incorporation into Seminole clan and community structures. Some Black Seminole individuals rose to positions of genuine military and political leadership within Seminole resistance, a level of integration that stood in sharp, direct contrast to the racial hierarchies enforced throughout the rest of the American South during this same period. This convergence of three distinct threads, remnant Florida indigenous populations whose deep ancestry traces back toward the world, revealed at Windover Creek-speaking migrants bringing agricultural and political tradition from the north, and formerly enslaved individuals bringing military knowledge and an absolute, uncompromising determination to defend their newfound freedom, produced a society with a genuinely unique set of characteristics that would prove decisive when the United States government eventually attempted, and repeatedly failed, to force total Seminole surrender. The First Seminole War began in 1817, driven substantially by American demands that Florida authorities, and by extension Seminole communities, return escaped enslaved individuals who had found refuge within Seminole territory. This underlying cause, and the strength of Seminole resistance to it, would define the entire subsequent conflict. When the United States formally acquired Florida from Spain in 1821, federal policy shifted decisively toward the forced removal of all Seminole communities to territory west of the Mississippi River, a policy that culminated in the 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing, an agreement whose validity and interpretation would remain fiercely contested by Seminole leadership, and which set the stage for the Second Seminole War, beginning in 1835, the longest, costliest, and most difficult conflict the United States government fought against any indigenous nation in its history. The military reality of this war reveals precisely why Seminole resistance succeeded where so many other nations, facing comparable or even lesser pressure, were ultimately forced into surrender. Seminole and allied Black Seminole fighters possessed an intimate, generations-deep knowledge of Florida's wetland terrain, knowledge that traced back, in an unbroken thread of accumulated practical understanding, toward the same landscape that had sustained continuous human life since the era documented at Windover 8,000 years earlier. American military forces, by stark contrast, found themselves fighting in an environment that was, for them, genuinely almost impossible to navigate or control. Dense cypress swamps, the vast waterlogged expanse of the Everglades, terrain where conventional military formations, supply lines, and strategy simply broke down. The human cost of the Second Seminole War, spanning from 1835 to 1842, was severe on every side. The United States government spent, by conservative contemporary estimates, in excess of $30 million, an extraordinary sum for the era, and suffered approximately 1,500 military deaths, a casualty rate that, when measured against the total forces committed, exceeded that of several better-remembered American conflicts of the same century. And despite this staggering expenditure of resources and lives, the war ended not in Seminole surrender, but in a kind of exhausted, unresolved stalemate. Many Seminole families were indeed forcibly removed westward to Indian Territory during and after this period, an event of genuine and lasting trauma and injustice. But a substantial number of Seminole families, by most historical estimates several hundred individuals, deliberately refused removal, retreating instead deep into the Everglades, into terrain so remote and so difficult that the United States government ultimately concluded, after years of costly, largely fruitless pursuit, that continuing the campaign was not worth the expenditure required. A third Seminole War followed in 1855, triggered by escalating tension between remaining Seminole communities and expanding American settlement. It too ended without achieving the complete removal or surrender that had been the federal government's explicit objective. The families who had retreated into the Everglades during the Second Seminole War and their descendants remained. To this day, the Seminole tribe of Florida holds the distinction, unique among indigenous nations of the United States, of never having signed a formal peace treaty or a formal surrender with the American government. The conflict, in the most literal and technically accurate sense, was simply never brought to a documented, mutually acknowledged conclusion. It stopped, without either side declaring victory. Modern genetic research into Seminole ancestry, conducted increasingly in careful partnership with the Seminole tribe of Florida and the separately federally recognized Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, descended from those families forcibly removed westward, confirms the deep complexity of this layered history. Genetic markers connect contemporary Seminole populations to Creek-speaking ancestral populations of the Southeast, to African ancestry reflecting the deep and historically significant integration of Black Seminole individuals and families, and in patterns still being carefully studied and understood, to markers suggesting at least some genetic continuity with the older pre-Creek indigenous populations of Florida, the very populations whose most ancient known representatives were preserved in the unique waterlogged conditions at Windover, 8,000 years before any of these later peoples would converge to form what the world now knows as the Seminole Nation. It is essential to be precise here. This is not evidence of one single simple bloodline running unbroken from Windover directly to the present day, an oversimplification that would badly misrepresent both the archaeological and the genetic evidence. It is evidence of something considerably more layered and, in its own way, more remarkable. A landscape whose distinctive ecological demands, the wetlands, the hammocks, the seasonal flooding, the specific knowledge required to navigate and survive within them, shaped human adaptation and survival strategy continuously across 8,000 years, through multiple genetically and culturally distinct populations, each generation of inhabitants adding to an accumulated body of practical environmental knowledge that the final convergence of Creek migrants, Black Seminole refugees, and Florida's own remnant indigenous survivors would ultimately inherit, refine further, and then use with devastating strategic effectiveness against the most powerful military force in North America. This reframes the meaning of Seminole resistance in a way that pure military history alone cannot fully capture. The Seminole were not simply a determined, resourceful people who happened to fight skillfully in difficult terrain. They were the inheritors, whether through direct unbroken ancestry, cultural transmission, or a combination of both, still being carefully untangled by ongoing research, of one of the longest continuous relationships between any human population and a specific demanding environment documented anywhere in North America. Windover proves that people were already thriving in these wetlands 8,000 years ago. The military record of the Seminole Wars proves that this same wetland environment, by the 19th century, had become effectively unconquerable by the most well-resourced military force on the continent. The genetic evidence increasingly suggests these two facts are not coincidental, but connected, separated by thousands of years, yet linked through a landscape whose fundamental demands never changed, even as the people living within it and drawing on its accumulated knowledge did. What number affected you most? 1. The 8,000-year-old preserved brain tissue and DNA recovered at Windover. 2. The 3 distinct ancestral threads, Florida Indigenous, Creek Migrant, and Black Seminole, that converged to form the Seminole Nation. 3. The strategic role that deep, generations-old knowledge of Florida's wetlands played in Seminole resistance. 4. The fact that the Seminole tribe of Florida has never signed a formal surrender or peace treaty with the United States government. 5. The documented integration and leadership of Black Seminole individuals within Seminole military and political structures. Or 6. The broader idea that a landscape itself can shape and connect human survival strategy across 8,000 years through multiple distinct populations. Write your number in the comments. If this investigation left you wondering how your own family's oral history might connect to documented Indigenous ancestry in the Southeast, I have put together a complete guide explaining exactly how to interpret consumer DNA results, what specific markers can and cannot reveal about Southeastern ancestry, and where the genuine limits of home testing begin. The link is in the description. In the next video, we head to the Pacific Northwest to examine the genetic legacy of one of the most contested and consequential discoveries in the history of American archaeology, the ancient remains known as Kennewick Man, a 9,000-year-old skeleton whose DNA the federal government fought for nearly a decade to keep out of the hands of the very scientists and the very indigenous nations who most needed to understand what it actually revealed.